Hey, everybody. Welcome to another edition of American Rambler. I'm your host, Colin Woodward. Thank you for listening to the podcast. On today's show, I have Professor John A. Kirk. He is a historian and a teacher of history down in Little Rock, Arkansas. I know John from my days in Arkansas. We have covered a lot of the same ground as researchers. John is the author or editor of 10 books. His book on Rockefeller is his most recent one. It's called Winthrop Rockefeller, From New Yorker to Arkansawyer, 1912-1956. You may be asking, Arkansawyer? Yes, that is what they used to call people from Arkansas. Arkansawyers, maybe some people still do. Most people use Arkansan. But if you look at old newspapers or whatever in the Arkansas territorial period, maybe, you will see it spelled as Arkansas with a W on the end, which kind of makes more sense. I mean, it looks like Arkansas. I saw Joe Walsh play in Little Rock once, and one of his asides to the audience was, why don't they call it Arkansas? So it is a little strange to see it spelled like that, but that was in usage for a long time. So that is part of John's title. It is a really good book. I'm enjoying reading it. It is the first, well, he hasn't written all of it. He hasn't written all of the story. There's a lot more to say about Rockefeller, but John's is really the first scholarly treatment of Rockefeller's entire life and career. There have been books about his governorship, but this one really goes deep into the archives, not just things in Arkansas, but also in New York. I had heard about this biography for a while. Even when I was in Arkansas, I knew John was working on it, and it finally came out this year, available through University of Arkansas Press. Same press as my book on Johnny Cash. But in one of the ironies of the podcasting world, this is probably the longest talk John and I have ever had. It was really great to catch up with him. It's been at least 7 years since we talked. I left in 2015. I'm sure I saw him at some point that year, but it's been a while since we really talked about anything. So it was great to catch up with him. And I am looking forward to the next installment of the Rockefeller saga. Winthrop, a really interesting guy, did a lot of great things for Arkansas. And John and I actually went to Cummins Prison together, not as felons. We were there as historians with the BBC. That was at the beginning of my research when I was still making a lot of mistakes. But we got the attention of the BBC, and we went down there to check out the chapel at Cummins and walk around a little bit. So that was memorable. And John was there. He has been department head. He has done a lot of things at UALR. But as you can tell, he is originally English. So it is nice to have John to class up the joint a little bit around here. Wanted to talk again about my book, not Marching Masters. I've already talked about that a million times. Country Boy, The Roots of Johnny Cash is available in paperback as well as Kindle. The paperback's going for $24.95. The Kindle's going for $14 and change, around $15. So you can get either of those. And I was working with the audiobook narrator last week, so that should be getting done fairly soon. That was an interesting email to kind of get dropped on me on a Monday. Said, hey, can you help me with all these pronunciations? I didn't know I had to do anything with the audiobook, but that makes all sense. You want to talk to the author about how things are pronounced. Some of them I was not sure of, but took my best guess. So that was a day or so working on that, but the audiobook should be done fairly soon, and not sure when that's available. I will give you an update the next time there is a podcast. Some sad news I wanted to talk about for a bit. Wes Freed has died. Wes was the artist for the Drive-By Truckers. He did the artwork for their best albums, no doubt about that, their best work. Wes did the art for Southern Rock Opera and Dirty South and Decoration Day, and most of them, in fact, he wasn't the first artist. They had another one that did the first couple albums, and there have been some photograph covers since then, but Wes has been the man for the Drive-By Truckers artwork, and he lived in Richmond for a long time. He was a fixture. I had the good fortune to do a podcast with him early on in my podcasting days. I think he was number 10 in terms of episodes, but very cool dude. We sat on his porch. We shared a beer, and he gave me at least an hour 20 or so. It was a nice long podcast, and has a nice dry sense of humor about him. But he was a musician too. He was in a bunch of bands. I have some of his music, which is really good, that he did with the Shiners and Dirtball, going back a little ways here in Richmond. But he was in a band called Mag Bats, which I saw him play with one night in Richmond. I guess that was the only time I saw him perform. But he was a fixture here in Richmond and did a lot of different things, not just the art and the music, but he acted a little bit. He was in a movie called Thrillbillies, which he did with Jim Stramel, who I also had on the podcast. So he was a real character and the real deal. And I'd see him walking around the fan sometimes, or down at Kroger. So you would see him around and you really couldn't miss him with his cowboy hat and his boots and everything. Seemed like he had a jacket on no matter what the weather was. He was definitely one of the guys that made Richmond a cool place to live. So it's very sad news to hear about that. He was only 58. I'm not sure if maybe there'll be some kind of a memorial concert or something that the truckers will do here in Richmond. I don't know. But he was certainly a big part of the drive-by truckers story and their history. So sorry to hear about Wes's passing. One last thing before the podcast starts. This is not my usual podcast in terms of audio quality. I tried using Zencaster and I couldn't hear John, so we had to switch over to Zoom, and Zoom did not pick up my microphone. So on the whole, the quality is pretty good, but I was not mic'd up the way I should have been or wanted to be. It was just kind of through the computer microphones. So there's going to be a little bit of a drop off here in quality between me talking and in the actual podcast, but I don't think you should mind. John is a good guest, and we got to talk about his background and also his book on Winthrop Rockefeller. So we got over an hour, and it was really great catching up with John. All right, here it is, my talk with John A. Kirk. Thanks for doing this. Sorry about the obligatory technological snafu. I'm glad we could talk after all these years. It's been a while.
Yeah. But, how long is it ago since you left ULR?
2015.
Wow.
So yeah, it's been 7 years, and doesn't you know how it is. It's like the time flies and everything. It doesn't seem like it's been that long. I want to congratulate you on the book and say thank you, because you are the first biographer of Winthrop Rockefeller, right? I'm sorry, they're the Ward book. Is that the only other one?
There's a couple of books by Ward, and there's a book by Kathy Irwin that's about his governorship.
Right.
But this is the first book that covers those early years.
And you're kind of going whole hog, I assume, with the whole.
Yeah, probably so.
Where's that at? Have you written a huge manuscript and this is kind of part one, or are you going to write it later?
Write it later.
Yeah.
To be continued.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, you've been a productive guy. This is your 10th book?
That's right, yeah.
Has it been harder the last few years getting stuff done, or are you pretty disciplined?
Pretty disciplined. Actually, it's been easier because of the COVID and lockdown. So I'd kind of finished the research for this book just before COVID hit, and then the COVID lockdown kind of freed up time to get the book written. So it worked out quite well.
I sort of had an initial spurt of energy with like doing something I wanted to do scholarship wise, like during lockdown, but then when things kind of opened back up, it was hard. It seems like I mean, you've been really good at doing the research. And I wanted to ask you this at some point. Do you kind of have like a schedule you keep, or is it a little bit more informal than that?
Yeah, it's more informal than that. I mean, as you know, I'm teaching and admin responsibilities and all that kind of stuff. So essentially, you have to fit the research in around the other responsibilities. So really, you have to grab the time while you've got the chance. Although, of course, it helps with me in terms of the fact that the Winthrop Rockefeller papers are in the same city as me and just down the road. So
right,
fairly easily accessible. Admin jobs, while I was writing it as well, I was chair for 5 years, then director of the Anderson Institute for 4 years. So I kind of went back to faculty just before COVID started, so that helped as well. I didn't have the admin stuff to do, and I had the freer time because of the COVID. So it kind of worked just right. If I had to do the research still while COVID was on, the archives were closed, so I couldn't do it. So I was at
Yeah.
that point to get the writing done, and that didn't inconvenience me much. So I could just, be on lockdown, be at home in front of my computer and get the writing done.
And you are a dad too, right?
That's right. My daughter, Sadie, starts senior year this year. This is the last year of high school. So that's kind of interesting too.
Is she going to college?
Yeah, yeah. That's her hope and aspiration. She'll be applying this fall for different colleges.
Does she have a favorite or not sure?
I think she's got a range of places that she's going to apply to and see what happens, see where she gets in, see what kind of deals they give her, and then kind of make a choice based on that.
You think she'll leave Arkansas or
I think she'd like to and
yeah.
see different parts of the U.S.
Yeah. Well, I think I maybe saw her once or twice at a function at UALR, and of course, I was 10 years ago, so she was pretty young then.
Yeah, I mean, when we moved here in 2010, she was 5 years old and just starting kindergarten. So she came in right at the ground floor for the schools, which made it a good time to move. And now
Yeah.
kind of gone through that process, and 12 years later, she's a senior and getting ready to graduate.
I do want to kind of go back because obviously you're English, so I want to pry a little bit into your background because you've been in Arkansas about what 12 years now? Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, 12 years.
Where are you from in England originally?
From near Manchester,
Okay.
a town called Rochdale, just about 15 miles out of Manchester.
Okay. Yeah, I wasn't sure how to place your accent because it's obviously not a London accent, but you're what is Manchester considered? Is that uh that's not Midlands, right? That's
No,
more Birmingham.
yeah, it's northwest of England,
Okay.
they call it.
Yeah.
My accent has got kind of flattened out over the years because I moved to various different places. So it's my accent is not as thick as it once was. But
Yeah.
when I'm on the phone to my mom, it kind of gets thicker.
Right.
Back to it when I go back home, but yeah, it's become a lot more generic. I think people who from the UK can place me in the underline it all, place the accent in the northwest of England. I think it comes through at some point, but yeah, it's certainly not as pronounced as it was when I was growing up.
Well, it's interesting because I mean, it's a relatively small country geographically, but there's so many variations with the accents. I mean, just in England, let alone Wales and Scotland and Ireland, other parts of the UK. But it seems like people in England can tell where you're from pretty much right away, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Some are stronger than others. Like Liverpool accent and the Newcastle accent are very strong. You can locate that, and you can locate kind of broader areas of the country where people are from by their accents. Yeah, I mean, apparently in Chaucer's time, there was a different accent every 3 miles, and you know, there are still local variations like that that exist in the UK. You can tell, like growing up,
Yeah.
you could tell somebody who was 3 miles away who came from a different village, they'd have a different accent than mine. So you could really locate, if you had an ear for it, you could locate exactly where people were from. Just
That's
based.
interesting. And is there sort of a generic English accent, if there is such a thing? Like, let's say you met someone from Florida here in the U.S., like kind of they might just have this sort of generic American accent or whatever. If they're from Ohio or something, like it's kind of hard to tell. But is there a place in England that's like that, like on the coast, or I don't know, or does everyone
I
have
don't
some
think
variation?
I think kind of the standard British accent is the Queen's English, right? The BBC accent.
Okay.
I think that's kind of quoted as the sort of standardized British. I'm not sure if it's an accent from anywhere as much as a constructed accent that is kind of Reconstruction
Okay.
on BBC. It's kind of fun.
Yeah.
It tries to obscure being from anywhere, I think.
Yeah. So sometimes it's kind of a fun little game if I'm hearing a podcast or something that people are from England and I can't really place the accent. It's kind of fun to find out where they're from. Listen to this horror movie podcast where the guys are from Teesside, which is kind of like on the eastern part, like
Yeah, right.
like
Around
midway.
Newcastle.
Yeah, I couldn't place the accent initially. Like, where are these guys from? So I had to do a little bit of research there. But what was it like there growing up? You said you were kind of like a smaller town outside of Manchester?
Yeah, Rochdale, which is about 12 miles outside. It's kind of a post-industrial landscape. I grew up listening to the Smiths and Joy Division, and it's about as bleak as those early albums sound.
Right.
It's kind of the equivalent, American equivalent of the Rust Belt,
Yeah.
and it was a kind of post-industrial landscape. That area, Manchester is where the Industrial Revolution started. So, it's filled with factories and textiles and all that kind of thing. And, that whole industry got hollowed out in the 80s. And that's when I was growing up there. So, the
Okay.
once booming economy completely collapsed. And now it's kind of, today it's kind of back in the gentrification stage, and, it's kind of being revitalized. But when I was growing up, it was pretty bleak, high unemployment, and a kind of classic Rust Belt sort of town.
So it wasn't suburban really. It was something different. It
Yeah,
was,
I don't know what
yeah.
what urban historians call it, ex-urban or something like that. It was, yeah,
Okay.
suburb. It was kind of like Manchester, is kind of, they call it Greater Manchester, so it's kind of grown like London, and it's just swallowed a bunch of different places into it. So there's specific towns within its orbit, but it's kind of become one big grown-up area. And when I grew up,
Yeah.
right on the edges of that, I grew up surrounded by the moors and open land, and kind of right on the edges of that vast sort of conurbation of different towns and that
Okay.
Manchester.
So you're kind of on the edge of the Hound of the Baskervilles in a way. It's like this haunted moor on the one
Right.
end, and then yeah.
Yeah, it's closer to Wuthering Heights.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I spent the semester in London. Unfortunately, I didn't get to see a lot of England. It's a few day trips and stuff, but I did think about actually studying in Birmingham because I was into Black Sabbath and the Moody Blues and all that. But by the time I was in London, Oasis was huge, and they're a Manchester band, right?
that's right. Yeah, that was the next phase after the Smiths and Joy
So
Division. Order.
were you still there when that music was big, or were you already gone?
I was gone then. I was just looking the other day, and definitely maybe had its 28th anniversary like a week or
Right.
two ago. And I just started my new job when that came out. So I just moved to Wales to take up my first tenure job. So yeah,
Yeah.
that distinctly being the soundtrack to my first job in Wales when all that came out.
Yeah, you've had a pretty amazing career path. I mean, you have in addition to publishing, I mean, you had tenure before you got to Arkansas. You talked about this first job you were in Wales. Where did you do your graduate work?
Yeah, I did my graduate work at the University of Newcastle upon Tyne in Newcastle, so I got familiar with the Geordie accent when I was while I was there.
And
Uh,
you did your undergrad in Nottingham.
that's right, yeah, in American Studies.
Okay. What got you into American history? I mean, American studies is a little different, but like what was the fascination there?
I when I did my A levels, or what's the kind of final 2 years of high school here, I had a headmaster at the school who taught American politics and was really kind of into American stuff. And I did one of my APs A levels in American politics, and really kind of got interested through that. And I did another qualification in American studies on the back of doing the classes for that. And he was really enthusiastic about it and a great teacher. And that's kind of what got me interested in American stuff. And then he pointed me towards the degree in American Studies at Nottingham. And then I had good mentors at Nottingham who pointed me towards Newcastle and the scholarship there. And they had one of the best civil rights scholars there. Uh,
Okay.
so I got good mentorship there. And then did my work in Newcastle, spent a year living in Little Rock from the summer of 1992 to 1993 when Bill Clinton was running for the first time for president. So it was kind of an interesting, exciting time to be here. And then did a bunch of research for that year, went back to Newcastle, started writing up. And then following year, before I'd finished writing up, got my first tenure track job at in Wales.
And you were in Little Rock because specifically civil rights and Central High?
That's right. Yeah, I started doing my PhD at Newcastle on the long civil rights movement in Arkansas. So, you know, everybody knows about the 1957 school crisis and its role in the kind of national narrative of the civil rights movement. But at the time, a number of books were being written that took those flashpoint events and kind of looked at them within a longer perspective of the history of the civil rights movement in the city and in the states to which they belonged. And Little Rock was one of the places that hadn't really received that treatment. So I decided to sort of write the history of the long civil rights movement in Arkansas and sort of work with the Arkansas State Press, the black newspaper, in Newcastle for a year, read all the copies of that, and then prepared to come over here to the US and work in the archives and do a bunch of oral history interviews in the year that I spent here before going back and writing up my thesis in Newcastle again.
Okay. Was Clinton actually president yet when you first got to Little Rock, or was he running?
He was running, yeah. So
Yeah.
when I started in the fall of '91, he was, you know, pretty much a
Okay.
scorching candidate, and nobody really gave him a chance. So it was fascinating to see because, you know, I was obviously interested in him because I had an Arkansas interest. And it was fascinating to see him move from, you know, the very fringes of the race and sort of take a hold and go on to win the presidency. So I was kind of focused on Arkansas all the way through that and kind of lived through that experience. So it made it all the more interesting.
Yeah. Well, obviously he put, Arkansas on the map in a lot of ways, but kind of one of the things you discover when you move to Arkansas is like how much influence there's been in kind of big and small ways. I mean, Walmart is really becoming huge in the 90s, and you have the Clintons and all of that, but you're there before obviously the presidential library is built. So where were you doing a lot of your research? I mean, they didn't really have cows yet either, so like where were you doing your research when you were in Little Rock that first time?
Yeah, I was based UA Little Rock on campus.
Okay.
The archives were in the library then. And Linda
Okay.
Klein was the main archivist way back then.
Right.
She was great and helped me out with the research and helped me. She provided me with a carrel in the archives that there used to be there at Little Rock in the library, and so I could work there. One of the interesting things I think about working on the book is that there was so much material outside of the state, so I had to travel outside of the state quite a bit. So the main bulk of the Daisy Bates papers, who was one of the leading civil rights advocates in Arkansas, are in Madison, Wisconsin. The SNCC papers for Arkansas are in Madison, Wisconsin too. I spent quite a while in Madison, then quite a while in Washington, D.C., looking at the branch files for the NAACP and the National Urban League and those national organizations. So a lot of African American history about Arkansas is outside of the state, I discovered. You know, I was looking at local stuff here and doing oral history interviews, which were an important part of kind of fleshing out the historical record, and also just digging up collections that were around in the state that hadn't been collected. Perhaps one of the most significant was the William Harold Flowers papers, which were in Pine Bluff. And I'd been reading about Flowers in the Arkansas State Press, and he unfortunately passed away just a year before I made it to Arkansas. But his law office is in Pine Bluff, had all his papers there. And Stephanie Flowers, who's now a state senator in the Arkansas General Assembly here, is his daughter. And she moved back to sort of sort out her father's estate and ended up moving back permanently to Pine Bluff. But she allowed me to go in his law offices and kind of use his papers there as he'd left them. So I kind of got to go and work in his law office from his chair at his desk, kind of going through his papers there. Discovered that, he had a trove of papers written to him by Thurgood Marshall and Walter White and all the kind of NAACP leadership that he'd had. And, she still has those papers. They've never been donated to an archive. So I was pretty fortunate to, I think I'm the only real scholar to have kind of looked at that collection. So yeah, it involves a lot of legwork doing Black history in Arkansas, because a lot of the stuff has been uncollected and a lot of stuff is still out there in private hands. So it took a lot of detective work to piece all these things together.
Yeah, well, and I think, as you know, I mean, obviously there's a lot of fertile ground in Arkansas because, things haven't been collected or they're spread out. But as your experience showed, like, you can have those times where someone's basically like letting you into their house. And like, yeah, that's the stuff's inside. Knock yourself out, or
Right.
some kind of equivalent of that, which makes it very cool to be a historian and archivist there. But do you find it kind of, it's more so like that in Arkansas than other places? I mean, archives are kind of traditionally these very elite spaces, but one good thing about Arkansas is, yeah, it's sort of, if you have the initiative, you can find this stuff. Has it been kind of more fun in a way doing research in Arkansas than maybe other places?
Yeah, I think so. It's been both more fun and more challenging too.
Right.
The stuff isn't all there for you. It's not all collected for you, and you have to do a lot of the legwork yourself. I mean, part of it, I think, is, the flagship universities up in the northwest part of the state, and, it has an archives collection there, but, it doesn't have that big of a reach, I think, down to central Arkansas and the southern part of the state, where the, vast majority of the Black population has always lived in Arkansas. And the archives in Little Rock have, been growing for a while, but, it's taken time, I think, to kind of rationalize the collections there and start to build the collections there. So there's not really the same kind of archival centers that other states have had, particularly for collecting Black history in the state. I think Arkansas has come fairly late to that. And a lot of those papers have been siphoned off to other states because of that, because there was nowhere to put them, or people didn't feel confident putting them in archives in Arkansas. So yeah,
Right.
it's an interesting challenge in its own right to work on state history here.
Yeah, and that pretty much sums up my feelings about my time in Little Rock. It was like they had great collections, but it was, honestly, I was walking into a mess. And so, organizing it was a lot of fun, but it was challenging. And I don't know if this has changed, but I mean, the state archives, they don't have retention schedules, or they didn't when I was there. So the governor's papers could end up really anywhere.
Right,
Which,
I think that's still the case.
okay, yeah, that's not the case in Virginia. The governor's papers go to Richmond and the Library of Virginia, but Arkansas, kind of being the Wild West, is like, well, it could be Fayetteville, it could be in Little Rock, it could be somewhere else. I think Huckabee's papers are, I don't know, they're down the southern part of the state somewhere, aren't they?
I think at
Like,
Washington Baptist.
okay, okay. Yeah, so that makes it interesting, challenging. Not that I want to study Huckabee necessarily, but in doing the Johnny Cash research, I mean, there's very little archival material anyway, but there was some great stuff at Euler. So that was, it's like discovering gold. I mean, with some of these projects, and as you say, as you found out, in African American history in the state's been really understudied. State generally, it's just criminally understudied. So I'm glad you're there, John, and
Yeah.
doing this work. But just one more thing about England. Who was your advisor in grad school that you did your dissertation with?
Yeah, well, I kind of ended up having two advisors.
Okay.
The person I went to do my degree with was Tony Badger. And he was one of the top civil rights scholars in the UK at the time, and which is why I was pointed in his direction. But in my first semester there, he was appointed as the Paul Mellon Professor at Cambridge, which was a kind of top job in the
Yeah.
country for an American historian. And he took the job there, and I decided to stay in Newcastle because they had a scholarship there, and because I'd already gotten started. And then he was replaced at Newcastle by Brian Ward, who was a fairly younger scholar then, an up and coming scholar, and he was a great person to have as well. So I had Tony Badger, who was a kind of more senior, more experienced scholar, to help on that end, and I had Brian coming through, who was finishing his PhD himself when he got the job. So I had somebody who was understood the field at the time and the kind of things that I was faced with in writing up a PhD. So I really looked out in having two very different but two very good advisors for my
Yeah.
PhD. So yeah, that was lucky. I've been quite lucky all along to get the right mentors at the right time that have helped me kind of move on to the next stage, and that's been pretty important to me.
Well, that's nice. The I don't know much about the PhD programs in the UK. Is it like kind of a boot camp for a couple of years where you're taking a lot of classes and then you're like ABD, or is it pretty independent from the get-go? How's it kind of structured?
Oh yeah, absolutely independent from the get-go. It was then. I think it's changed now and become
Okay.
structured and more kind of along the American lines. But when I went straight from doing my undergraduate degree to a PhD. So I don't have a master's. I didn't do a master's program at all. And basically, I'd turn up and had a discussion with Tony Badger, and we decided what I was going to do, and we just kind of worked it from there. And he just said, "Go read these books, go read these primary materials, and there you go, and away you go." And I'd meet with him, maybe once or twice a month to check in on what I was doing, but pretty much free reign. I didn't take any classes. I actually taught classes while I was there, but I didn't take any classes, and it was just pure research and straight into the material and figure it out from there, which is kind of an unnerving experience, but a good one to have too, to have to figure all this stuff out, because once you've done it once, then that's a great experience for doing it a second and third and so on.
So is there that kind of weeding process initially where like people are kind of dropping out their first year or two, or is there the retention a bit better than because in the US I think it is like boot camp. It's like they kind of knock people out in the first year or two, but maybe it was better the way you did it, you know? Did you have a cohort of people that kind of stayed all the way through, or was the attrition pretty high?
They didn't have many graduate students when I went there, so there's maybe I think one
Okay.
person there when I started. And then when Brian came along, he began to build up a cohort of PhD students. So several came in after me, and so I was really at the beginnings of Newcastle building up a graduate cohort when I got there. So there wasn't really a big cohort to hang out with. Certainly my first year there, and then I spent my second year away in Little Rock. So there was more of a cohort when I went back for my third year, and there were more people working on their graduate work then. But yeah, it was I was a kind of pioneer at the time, and
Okay.
had the scholarship there to attract graduate students. And of course, at that time, I think when I sort of went into it in the early '90s, there'd been a bunch of cuts in the 1980s, and there hadn't been much hiring in the profession at all. And I was kind of the beginning of a kind of wave of revival of hires starting and programs starting. So it was kind of a good time to be in there on the ground floor for a kind of new wave of expansion in higher education in the UK.
Like when you were growing up, were there a lot of books in the house? Like, were you a big reader as a kid?
I was a big reader as a kid. We didn't have a lot of books in the house, but I made extensive use of libraries. My own village, which is just outside of Rochdale, had a pretty good branch library, and Rochdale itself had a pretty good library. So yeah, I read quite a lot, but it was pretty random and what just looked of interest on the shelves. So I kind of went through and see what they had and read whatever was around. So it wasn't particularly disciplined. It was pretty, pretty open and whatever I could get my hands on.
So were you kind of the first person in your family to go to grad school?
Yeah, that's right. I was the first generation college student. My mom and dad met when they were in their teens, both working in a carpet factory in Rochester.
Okay.
My mom worked as a weaver on a loom. My
Oh,
dad
wow.
was a carpet fitter. And
Okay.
when me and my brother came along, my mom quit to take care of us full time, and my dad worked in the building trades. He worked as a manual laborer for all of his life on different building sites. So yeah, it wasn't a particularly academic environment that I grew up in, but they certainly encouraged me to do well at school and to use education as a platform for social mobility, which thankfully I was able to do. Also with assistance too. When I went to university at Nottingham, I got a full ride. I got, not only my fees paid at the university, but also a stipend to live off as well. That has kind of disappeared now. So I was quite fortunate in the timing to be able to afford to go to university, particularly from the background I came from.
Is that world disappearing in the UK in terms of working class household? The mom doesn't have to work. You can raise your kids, send them to school. Does that still exist, or has that kind of disappeared the way it has in the US?
Yeah, I think it's disappearing too. And I was
Yeah.
one of the last cohort to go through with a full state grant to get through university. I was also fortunate that all my PhD was covered as well. I got a grant to go there and a maintenance grant to live off while I was doing my PhD. So I was extremely fortunate to have that kind of state-sponsored help that got me through. That otherwise I probably, would not have been able to do my undergraduate or graduate degrees without that kind of state support, which has collapsed now. So I don't know if I was starting off all over again. I'm not sure that I would do the same thing given the changed circumstances. So I'm pretty grateful that in a number of ways that I was, in the right place at the right time to be able to do what I did and where I am now.
Why did you want to write this book on Winthrop Rockefeller?
Yeah, it's kind of an outgrowth of my earlier research on the civil rights movement in the state, which has been my focus. And, I learned about Winthrop Rockefeller through doing the research for that. And I always made a kind of mental note that it would be interesting to go back and learn more at some point. Rockefeller seemed like a fascinating figure. It was very much a man out of time. It was curious to have a Rockefeller from this really powerful and well-known American family living in Arkansas, and this idea that he moved, to a rural mountaintop in the mid 1950s just seemed like a really odd story that deserved further exploration. Plus the fact that, when he came here, the stuff that he did, the fact that he became the first Arkansas Republican governor in 94 years in a solidly Democratic state in 1966, and that during that process he beat Jim Johnson, who was the state's leading segregationist, and pretty much put to bed the neo-Confederate Democratic Party and the segregationist political force in the state with his victory in 1966, and opened up the way for a string of more progressive New Democrats to shape the state. And the fact that, as a Republican, being elected in 1966, just at the time that the Republican Party nationally was becoming the party of Goldwater and moving to Nixon, Rockefeller brought that sort of old style, moderate Rockefeller republicanism to Arkansas, and has been described by one state commentator as the most liberal governor that Arkansas ever had. So all those things just kind of fascinated me and seemed like a puzzle that needed further examination and to take a look at, really. And so that's what pulled me in and interested me.
No, I mean he's definitely a figure that's screamed for more scholarship. And I know, yeah, like you said, there's the Ward book and Kathy Irwin's book, which isn't really a full scale biography. And Ward, I mean, it's safe to say, I mean, it's not, it's kind of borderline hagiography, right? I mean, it's not an especially critical look at Rockefeller, is it? That book that he wrote, the first
Right.
one.
And, I mean, John Ward was also a kind of employee of Winthrop Rockefeller's.
Okay,
He was
yeah.
a public relations officer throughout the 60s. He ran Rockefeller's campaign in 1968 for governor. So it's very much an insider account. And, it's a really good, useful account in the absence of anything else that we've had, and, sustained the kind of Rockefeller story for 50 years or so now. But it seemed time to write a scholarly biography of Rockefeller that was kind of steeped in the archival and richer archival resources that exist for his life. And, unfortunately, John Ward has passed away now, but I was in contact with him just before he passed away. And, he was very supportive of the book and said, it was time for a scholarly biography to be written. So he was quite supportive, and he kind of understood the nature of his own book and its limitations. So it's kind of like a new generation of scholarship on Rockefeller that hopefully the book launches.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'm writing about John Ward now for the EOA, so I'm gonna have to reckon with his books in a little bit. But obviously, you mentioned it, but I mean, the Winthrop Rockefeller papers are at UALR and they're enormous, so you have a lot of material there. But did you do your first research in New York?
That's right. Yeah, I really got started on the research before I moved to Arkansas to take the job here. I saw a advertisement for a competition to be a scholar in residence at the Rockefeller Archive Center. It was a inaugural competition, and so while I was at the University of London, I applied for that and got that award, and that allowed me to go and work at the Rockefeller Archives, which is in Pocantico Hills in Westchester County, just north of New York City. And I spent time working with family papers and the Rockefeller papers there, really to write a essay on Winthrop Rockefeller and the Civil Rights Movement, and that was published as a book chapter. But that stretch of research really got me interested in writing the larger story of Winthrop Rockefeller's life. And then a year later, I applied for and got the job as chair of the history department at UA Little Rock. And of course, that put me right next to the Winthrop Rockefeller papers, which are housed in the city. So that was convenient and helpful. But of course, at the same time, I also had fairly heavy administrative jobs here too. I was chair of the department for 5 years. I was then director of the Anderson Institute on Race and Ethnicity for 4 years. So although the papers were tantalizingly close, I also had a lot more responsibilities of day-to-day jobs to do. And so I kind of managed to snatch an afternoon here and a weekend there, getting work done in the papers. And so kind of it was a slow burning project for a lot of that time.
Okay.
Accumulate enough research so that when the COVID lockdown started in 2020, I'd moved back to faculty full time just before then. And thankfully, having all that bank of research, then I had a tranche of time on lockdown, more than I would usually have, to sit down and to get the book written. So it kind of worked out okay in those terms.
Now, just to go back a little bit, because you were in London before you moved to Little Rock, you had tenure, you were a full professor at the University of London, correct?
That's right. Yeah, I spent 5 years at the University of Wales in my first job there, teaching there, and then moved to London in 1999, and spent 11 years at the University of London before I moved to Arkansas in 2010.
Now, what prompted that move? Exactly. I mean, that's a sort of Rockefeller-ish kind of move. I mean, he's going from New York to Little Rock, you're going from London to Little Rock. There's a little bit of culture shock there. I know you had been there before. Did you just kind of like it and the job opened, you figured what the hell? Or what did you like about, or what was what was the situation in London? Did you like it there, or you were kind of ready to move?
I liked it in London a lot. It's just extremely expensive to live there.
Yeah.
And, I had a young family. My daughter was 5 years old when we moved, and the opportunity came up to work at UA Little Rock. And I'd always felt at some point as an American historian that I would like to live, work, and teach in the United States. So that was always an aspiration I had. And
Okay.
the right job came up at the right time, really. The chair's job came up. I was contemplating and has been sort of leaned on to apply for the chair's position at the University of London in the department I was in. So that was kind of already on my mind at the time. And if I hadn't have moved here as chair, I would have probably been chair in London. But, the idea of becoming chair was already there. And when the opportunity came up in Little Rock, it offered a chance to move to experience education in the United States, to be closer to the archives for my research. Of course, it's a lot easier to do Arkansas history in Arkansas than it is in London.
Right, right.
All of those things kind of came together, and it was just the right time.
Yeah.
My daughter was 5 years old, so she could easily move across the education system and start in kindergarten when she got here. So it was the right job at the right time, really, as often these things work out.
Sure. And do you think you would ever move again? I mean, either somewhere else in the US or back to England, or do you like Little Rock? You think you'll stay a while?
Yeah, who knows? It's 12 years later on, and my daughter's just started her senior year, and she'll be heading off to college next year. So we don't have that kind of, to tie us down anymore, and
Right.
have more family freedom. But
Yeah,
again, it's just a question of what opportunities come up, when and
sure.
where, really. But I do like it here. I enjoy doing research here. I've made a career doing Arkansas history. So it's very convenient, and I enjoy Little Rock and enjoy living in Arkansas. But always alive and attuned to other possibilities and
Sure.
other opportunities elsewhere as well. So always keep my eyes and ears open. But I enjoy it here, and I have no pressing reason to move at the moment.
Okay. Well, I mean, you can certainly make your mark in Arkansas if you're kind of driven as you are and you have. I'm glad that's worked out, but I mean, yeah, I understand that kind of needing to be near the sources. I mean, it does feel totally different where you're when you're in Little Rock doing research on an Arkansas topic than when you're somewhere else. And that's been a little frustrating for me sometimes, just not having access to the sources, even if it's a small couple pages I'm writing on. But not having access to the libraries or the archives definitely makes it the job a lot harder. But with Rockefeller, there's a ton of material. So it seems like for you, your problem was maybe more just kind of trimming it down because the family history side, the money, like all that, he still led a pretty interesting life. I mean, he's in the military during World War II. That's about where I am with the book now. I'm mostly through it, but he's in the Pacific now and is about to fight and everything. So it's a really interesting story. Obviously, he becomes governor of Arkansas later. When does he kind of become political? Because I haven't really gotten to that yet. And even the family doesn't seem like they're an especially political family, but they were solid Republicans, the Rockefellers.
That's right. I mean, they're steeped in Republican Party membership. His grandfather, John D. Rockefeller Sr., was, a Northern abolitionist during the Civil War, and was, with the Republican Party from its very earliest days, and had Republican loyalties. They weren't necessarily overtly into Republican politics, certainly on his paternal side, because Winthrop's mother, Abby, her father was a Republican senator from Rhode Island and one of the sort of kingmakers in the party in the late 19th century. So there's a pretty solid Republican background on both sides of the family when he was growing up. But yeah, he wasn't overtly political. He thought about political career at various points, but kind of in passing. And even when he came to Arkansas, I don't think he was. He came to with an idea of taking political office in mind. He was pretty reluctant and hesitant to embark upon a political career, but I think he kind of fell into it almost by default. He fell in love with the state. He had a number of projects. in the state, and very much wanted to sort of move the state forward economically, politically, and socially, and culturally as well. And I think he came to the conclusion in the end that to do that, he would have to run for political office to sort of make that project that he'd been working on for the modernization of Arkansas a reality. So I think he kind of became a politician by default. It wasn't his natural habitat. Not like his brother, of course, Nelson, who was the kind of family politician, and he was governor of New York and became vice president of the United States under Gerald Ford in the 1970s, and was within a whisker at one point of becoming president himself. So he was the one with political ambitions in the family. Winthrop kind of less so, I think.
Yeah. Is that because of the assassination attempts on Ford? Is that what you mean?
No, a lot earlier.
Okay.
In the mid 1960s. It was when Barry Goldwater sort of started the kind of rightward lurch of the Republican Party in the 1960s. He was running against Rockefeller, and had history kind of for the nomination for the Republicans, and had history gone another way, and
Okay.
Rockefeller beat Goldwater. Then Nelson Rockefeller's career and the trajectory of the Republican Party as a whole may have gone in a very different direction. So I think 1964, Nelson Rockefeller and Winthrop Rockefeller were there at a significant turning point in national politics for the Republican Party.
Right. Because the Democrats, I mean, LBJ trounces Goldwater in the election, but sort of that winning the peace type of thing, because then 4 years later you get Nixon. So it becomes essentially more conservative, right? The Republican Party, but the Rockefellers are kind of, would you say they're moderate Republicans?
Yeah, moderate Republicans. Of course, the watchword for moderate Republicans in the 1950s was Rockefeller Republicans.
Oh, you're right. Yeah.
They kind of defined what a moderate Republican looked like. And, Barry Goldwater's sort of hijacking of the party in 1964 really kind of put an end to that moderate wing of the Republican Party that slowly withered and died, and set the party on the trajectory of the party of Nixon, Reagan, and Trump. That kind of strand sort of grew out of that crucial 64 redefining of Republican Party national politics.
Yeah. Well, and you were just at Petit Jean Mountain yesterday. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, I was there giving a talk to the Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation. I was there a couple of weeks before that to talk to the Winthrop Rockefeller Institute. And both of those entities are kind of testimony to Winthrop Rockefeller's longevity in the state and just how much his name and legacy are still impactful today. And that's another kind of interesting thing about writing about his life and being here in the state to do it, that there are so many sort of tangible, direct legacies of his life still active and still very much part of the public consciousness in Arkansas.
For sure. Now, for people who don't know what Petit Jean is, just kind of describe that location in Arkansas.
Yeah, Petit Jean Mountain is about 60 miles or so northwest of the state capital of Little Rock, just outside the town of Morrilton. And it's partly a state park now, but it's where Winthrop Rockefeller decided to buy some 900 acres in 1953 to start a cattle farm called Winrock Farms. And it rapidly expanded after that. And he sort of cleared the brush and scrubland on top of the mountain and grew it into a sort of a model cattle breeding operation. Brought Santa Gertrudis cattle into Arkansas, and had record-breaking sales up there within several years of founding the farm. So it was, and Winrock Farms is still there today. It's still a cattle farm as well as part of the University of Arkansas system, a part of it now under the Winthrop Rockefeller Institute. So yeah, it was the kind of anchor and his first major project in the state, building this model cattle farm when he came in 1953.
Yeah, it's a really great spot. It was, I think, one of my favorite spots in Arkansas because it's got a park and everything. I mean, they can go swimming there. You can, I guess you could probably camp and everything. It's a big, almost like a city on a hill. It's not it's not a city, but it's got a great view, and it's a state that loves doing stuff outdoors. It's really a nice spot. So I always did like going there.
Yeah,
Um,
it's a beautiful place, and it's more than one person has noted that it's also kind of reminiscent of Winthrop's grandfather's place up in Kirk, where Winthrop spent a lot of his weekends growing up with his family. It kind of overlooks the Arkansas River, just as Kirk overlooks the Hudson River, and it's perched up on top of a hill and has great views all around it. So it was kind of, in some ways, a home away from home for Winthrop, I think.
and so this move to Arkansas, is it initially about raising cattle? Is that why he decides on Arkansas?
No, not at all. I mean, that kind of comes afterwards as a kind of
Okay.
afterthought, really. There's two reasons why he moves to Arkansas. There's a kind of push and pull factor. The push factor is his divorce. He got married in 1948 to a someone who grew up as a Lithuanian coal miner's daughter in Pennsylvania, Barbara Sears.
Okay.
As she was called then. She went by the name of Bobo, more popularly. She'd already been married into a fairly wealthy family, the Sears family, and had been got divorced there, and met Winthrop after he came back from World War II. The couple had a whirlwind romance and ended up getting married in Florida in 1948. But an 18-month marriage ended up as a protracted 5-year divorce afterwards, and the divorce kind of made all the tabloid headlines in New York and was kind of a big celebrity divorce. And Barbara Sears was an actress, and didn't have many resources in her divorce, but had publicity and an ability to work the media on her side. And the Rockefellers were a very secretive and private family, and Winthrop, having his name put in the tabloid headlines almost seemingly perpetually, he finally had enough of that and decided to move away from New York and the glare of all that and move to somewhere far more anonymous on a mountain 60 miles out of Little Rock. But of course, at the time, he could have pretty much moved anywhere he wanted to in the world and set up
Right.
operations. Why Arkansas? Well, a large part, the main part of why he moved to Arkansas was because of a friend that he'd made during his military service who was from Little Rock, called Frank Newell, who was an insurance agent in Little Rock. He'd served alongside Winthrop both when he was training for the Second World War in the United States, and had served overseas side by side with him in the military there in the various Pacific campaigns that they both fought in. And throughout those times, Frank had told Winthrop about what a great place Arkansas was, what a great place to live, how beautiful it was, and said, he should move there after the war. And of course, after the war, Winthrop went back to New York and worked with the family concerns there. And he tried to get Frank Newell to move to New York to help work with him there in the family business. And there's a great letter that I quote in the book from Frank, I think 1947, where Frank Newell says to him, "No, I'm not moving away from Arkansas, and I'll see you move to Arkansas before you ever see me move to New York." And of course, that proved pretty prophetic. And when Winthrop was looking to escape New York, he kind of took Frank up on his offer to move to the state and kind of went and joined his friend down there. Initially set up in the penthouse suite at the Hotel Sam Peck, right in the middle of downtown Little Rock, and was thinking of living there. But then Frank Newell took him out to Pettigene Mountain, and it was a place that Frank had grown up with and stayed with his family, and was a beautiful place that he enjoyed, and he thought his friend Winthrop would enjoy it too. So he took him up to the mountaintop and showed him this land that was for sale there. And Winthrop was smitten with it, just as Frank was, and he decided to buy that land and clear the land, and built a home and a kind of cattle farm there, and moved up onto the top of the mountain to be next to the farm and its operations, built a family homestead on the side of the mountain. And, several years later, the farm was built and he set down roots in the state. And the rest, as they say, is history. And he spent the last 20 years of his life living there on top of Pettigene Mountain and based in Arkansas.
Yeah. Now, Win Paul, was that from his first marriage or his second marriage?
That's right, from his first marriage to Barbara Sears.
Okay.
They were married 18 months, but I guess the kind of thing that came out of the marriage that was lasting was his son, Win Paul Rockefeller, who eventually ended up following his father to Arkansas and taking over the family farm and following his father's footsteps in a political career. Win Paul was lieutenant governor of Arkansas and was in the process of running for governor and would probably have become governor of the state, but sadly fell ill during the course of the campaign and had to withdraw and ended up passing away at a fairly young age, just as his father had. Win Paul passed away when he was just 57, and Winthrop had died when he was 60. So they both died from fairly rare forms of cancer. So both died fairly tragically young in the end.
Did Win Paul live a little healthier than his dad, or did he have kind of the same weaknesses there?
I'm not sure about that. I think he was a smoker like his dad as well, and I think I'm not exactly sure what the cause between the deaths was, whether it's genetic or environmental. But yeah, they both died fairly tragically young.
I know it's not necessarily how you live, I mean, obviously genetics is a big role, but as we see in this book, kind of Rockefeller he's developing some bad habits as he gets a little older. He does start smoking eventually and drinking. For a while, he's pretty much a teetotaler, but once he kind of, it's around the time he hits the Texas oil fields, he starts drinking a little bit more. Is that when it happens? I know it's still okay.
When he goes to Yale, he starts drinking and smoking there.
Oh, right, yeah.
He came from a fairly strict background. His father was a big supporter of prohibition. His father didn't smoke and his father didn't drink, and was a kind of a sort of a strict Baptist in that sense, and a religious guy, and tried to use money to persuade his sons and daughter not to smoke too. He offered them a kind of financial bribe if they didn't smoke until their 21st birthday. So he was intent on them not smoking and drinking. But when Winthrop finally escaped his family orbit and kind of struck out on his own for the first time at Yale University, he quickly fell into a crowd where he started drinking and smoking, and particularly the drinking he regretted, and he struggled variously with alcohol throughout his life. And I think, kind of got worse towards the end of his life, particularly when he had stresses and strains of being governor and kind of having to deal with those things on a daily basis too.
And it seemed like at Yale too, in addition to kind of his socializing and living it up, he had kind of legitimate learning disabilities, it seems. Have you been able to kind of pin that down? Was he dyslexic, or what was kind of going on there? Because it seemed like he had trouble with reading comprehension, but obviously he's a smart guy and his letters are great to read. He was a good letter writer, but what do you kind of make of that process at Yale? What's going on there?
Yeah, from what I understand, dyslexia made it difficult for him to read.
Yeah.
Struggled with reading all the way through his life. And that certainly affected his early schoolwork. He began in school at Columbia, the Teachers College there, Lincoln High School, which was an experimental school started by the Rockefellers. And that really revolved around experiential learning based on the theories of John Dewey at the time. And he really flourished in that sort of practical environment. But he didn't excel as a traditional academic scholar. And so they moved him to a prep school in Connecticut when he was 16 years old, to the Loomis Institute, which was, a far more kind of serious academic place. And he really struggled when he got there to make grades to get into university. He just about managed to get into Yale. But it is interesting reading the documentary record about his classes, and his teachers couldn't figure out why his grades were so poor when he seemed pretty smart in class and able to take the information in. And of course, they didn't really have the vocabulary or the expertise at the time to diagnose learning disorders, and they put all his learning, his inability to learn, down to his left-handedness.
Right.
He's
Yeah.
left-handed, and kind of intriguingly, his a couple of his other brothers, Nelson and David, were both left-handed too, and they both suffered dyslexia as well, to varying degrees. But it seems that Winthrop suffered the most from this and really struggled with his reading, and that affected him throughout his school career, and eventually led to his crashing of grades at Yale, to the extent that he really discovered that he couldn't continue on, and sort of fell on his sword and resigned from Yale before he got kicked out because of his bad grades there, and decided to take a much more sort of apprenticeship sort of approach to his career, and left Yale, and just a month later started working in the Texas oil fields as a roustabout laborer, determined to work his way up from the bottom floor through the various aspects of the oil industry, and more of a hands-on apprenticeship sort of education that would take him to a junior executive level.
Yeah, he seemed a lot more comfortable doing the kind of the hands-on things, the oil fields, but also World War II. He's in the thick of it there, and then the ranching later. So whether or not he had dyslexia and that hurt his ability to study, he just seemed more comfortable in these roles of being kind of one of the guys for a while. It's hard for them to look past the fact that he's a Rockefeller. And you have that fun anecdote about one of the guys thinks he's a spy in the oil fields. He's a Rockefeller spy.
Rockefeller points out to him that, if he was a spy, he probably wouldn't go under the name of Rockefeller.
Yes. Yeah, very well put. Obviously, he's kind of a black sheep in a lot of ways as one of the brothers in this enormously wealthy and influential family. What did the family think of him moving to Arkansas? How did they take that?
Yeah, at first, they didn't think that he was gone forever. He'd gone to various places to escape the publicity from his divorce. He spent 6 months in Venezuela working in the oil company there. So they mainly thought at the time that it was a kind of temporary escape and that he would come back. So they were kind of surprised, I think, when he ended up moving there full time. Rockefeller was quite different to a lot of the rest of the family. And I think he's had this kind of black sheep label pinned on him. And I sort of try and challenge that in the book. I try and point out that, kind of black sheep has a kind of stigma to it in Winthrop as kind of a lesser member of the family. I just say that he was different from the rest and had a different set of sensibilities that he expressed in different kind of ways. And, from an early age, he was kind of had more of a propensity for moving outside of the family's orbit and doing different kinds of things and mixing with different kinds of people. As a young child, he was bullied by his older brothers, which led to him growing up a lot of the times playing with the children of the chauffeurs and the children of the groundspeople at his grandfather's estate. And I think that kind of established early an ability for him to move in different circles and to move outside of the family's usual orbit. And you see that with his, move to the oil fields, the fact that he was the only one of the 5 Rockefeller brothers to volunteer as a private in the army to see infantry combat. And he wanted to do that. He believed that the Rockefeller family probably benefited more than anybody else from American democracy. And he was adamant that at least one of the brothers should be there fighting on the front lines. And he volunteered to do that. And he was able to mix in that kind of world in a way that his brothers probably wouldn't have been able to do. And probably none of his brothers would have ever thought of moving to Arkansas and moving away from that kind of East Coast power base that the Rockefeller family had. But Rockefeller was already kind of predisposed to be able to do those things and mix in those kinds of circles. And I think, moving to Arkansas was less of a surprise given his background and his career than it would have been for any of the other brothers. So in some ways, I'd see it in many ways as a kind of natural extension of the kind of experiences he'd had before he moved to Arkansas.
And maybe that's a little bit true of anyone that moves to Arkansas. If you're not from there, there's usually kind of a long and interesting backstory about how you would arrive. Some people it's a job, some people it's family, but it's not a big state in terms of population. It's in the middle of the country, so it's kind of its own thing. So it's interesting to see that he would settle there, but it certainly makes him very unique, and to me, kind of the most interesting Rockefeller. Really, I mean, I don't know much about the other members of the family, but I just think it's such a great story that he has becoming governor. And he seemed like all the way through, he's pretty progressive on racial matters. Is that fair to say? He didn't really have much baggage there.
Yeah, and part of that comes from his family background. As I said earlier, his grandfather John D. Rockefeller Sr. was a staunch Northern Baptist Republican abolitionist during the Civil War. And it's, said that one of his first acts of philanthropy in a prestigious and prodigious career in philanthropy was to loan money to an African American man so that he could buy his wife out of slavery. And, the Rockefellers were involved in funding Black education in the South. Winthrop Rockefeller grew up visiting Hampton College in Virginia, and was pen pals with some of the students there, which is a historically Black college university, and sort of mixed with Black students there. And when he came back from the Second World War, he was very involved with the National Urban League, one of the big six civil rights organizations in the United States in the 1960s. He served on its board of trustees for 24 years, only resigned when he embarked upon his political career and thought, he couldn't kind of be involved in politics and be on the board of trustees at the same time. And in that post-war era, was one of the faces of the National Urban League. He spoke many times at their conferences. He gave a lot of talks on their behalf across the country, and he also donated the equivalent of what today would be roughly around $1 million, so that the National Urban League could buy a headquarters in Manhattan. So that's a pretty hefty commitment to civil rights at a fairly early time in the 1940s. And he was recognized as such as well. He was interviewed by the Chicago Defender. They awarded him, they put him on the honor roll of democracy in 1948, among other luminaries like President Harry Truman and former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. And he considered himself the sort of family spokesperson on race relations in that post-war era. So he brought quite a strong background in race relations with him to Arkansas, and that was one of the political liabilities he brought to the state with him, because everybody knew him as an integrationist when he arrived. And one of the few people who traveled with him to Arkansas was a guy called Jimmy Hudson, who he'd known, and he was an employee for many years before he moved to Arkansas. And when he set up Winthrop Farms, he installed Hudson as general superintendent and insisted that anybody who wanted to deal with Winthrop Farms had to go through Jimmy. And of course, that put the noses out of joint for many white locals who didn't like the idea of having to go through an African American to do business with Rockefeller. But of course, everybody wanted to do business with Rockefeller because he instantly became the wealthiest person in the state. And if he said, you have to go through my African American associate to do business with me, then that's what they had to do. So, he began straight away by setting a marker when he moved to Arkansas that he wasn't going to bend to the racial mores of the state, and that he was going to challenge them. And that's certainly what he ended up doing throughout his political career.
It just kind of seemed to be that's the way he was. I mean, it didn't seem like there's any kind of paternalism or condescension behind it. It was just sort of, he kind of treated everyone as an equal.
Right, yeah, and I think it went far beyond this kind of noblesse oblige idea, and I think he had a very genuine commitment to the causes that he pursued, and in race relations too. I think he, it wasn't just a kind of academic or trivial exercise. It was something as he often did when he was interested in something, threw himself heart and soul into it. And certainly you see that in his work with the National Urban League after World War II, and that carries over to his work in Arkansas as well.
Yeah. All right, I'm getting the 1 minute warning, John. But I know there's a lot more we could talk about. But again, yeah, I don't want to keep you all day. But you're working on a sequel to this, is that correct?
That's right. Yeah, and this, the book has received a good amount of attention, and people received it warmly. So yeah, I'm kind of intrigued to write more about what happens in detail for the next episode in his life after he moves to Arkansas.
Yeah. Well, I'm really looking forward to that. I'm enjoying this book. It reads along really quickly, and obviously you've done your research and everything. So yeah, congratulations again, and thanks a lot for talking with me today.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it. Good to talk with you again.
All right, that was my talk with John Kirk. I hope you enjoyed that. Once again, his book is Winthrop Rockefeller, From New Yorker to Arkansawyer, 1912-1956. Available through University of Arkansas Press. You can get the hardcover for $34.95 and the Kindle for $14.72. So check that out. A very interesting, well-written, and engaging biography. Really enjoying reading it. You can also check out my books. I got 2 now. Marching Masters, Slavery, Race, and the Confederate Army During the Civil War, available through University of Virginia Press. Still going for $39.95 on Amazon, but the shipping date is quite extended. They're talking like a month or 2 to get it. So if you want a copy of Marching Masters and a lot sooner, I can still charge you the same price, but I can get it to you. I have some copies to ship, so you can contact me. I am on Twitter at Colin E. Woodward, or you can get in touch with me some other way. Email is also good. You can contact me at colinedward828@gmail.com. So that is Marching Masters, but you can also get Country Boy, The Roots of Johnny Cash, available from University of Arkansas Press, going for $24.95 paperback and $14 on Kindle. And the audiobook will be out before too long, so check back in about that if you want the audio version. Well, the Red Sox are still in last place, still under 500. They were playing the Rays again tonight, and Rays have been playing really well. So I don't think the Red Sox are going to make the playoffs, but I would like to see the Yankees choke big time, which they are in the process of doing. And I would like to see the Orioles make the playoffs as well, and would love to see an Orioles-Yankees series, but they've got their work cut out for them. But I think at this point with the Red Sox, if they can just have a winning season, that's about the best they can do. They're a ways out from getting into the playoffs, which been seeing that eventuality for a long time. It's been a very frustrating season, but I'm going to hang in there till the bitter end, as always. All right, got to get this podcast done. I will be talking with you again at some point in the fall with another interview and a new podcast about music. So follow me on Twitter if you want to see some updates, and just follow me on Twitter anyway. All right. I'll be talking with you soon. Take care. Bye.